Hello, I'm Phil Freestone, and today I'm going to present some of my discursive ethnographic research in China, specifically in Chengdu, based around the question, do Chinese gays come out? Which is a question which seemed important to people who I engaged with in China. But I've put Chinese gays in scare quotes here for a reason, as we'll see as we go through. So this is a discursive ethnographic investigation of queer identity in contemporary Chengdu. A bit background on the people that I engaged with here. This was fieldwork between 2016 and 2019, and the data in this presentation is taken from 11 individuals that I engaged with who might be defined as post-90, that's Zhouling Ho in Mandarin, same gender attracted, male identified, university educated, and Chengdu citizens. So some degree of categorization there for reasons of clarity. But as we'll see as we go on, I'm very much open to the idea that identity is fluid, nevertheless. I recruited these participants through existing friends, social media, and snowballing. I'd been living in China for a long time before this research project. The data in this presentation is taken from follow-up interviews after I'd engaged ethnographically with these people for quite some time, and I spotted salient themes to follow up on in interviews, which is what I'm citing today in terms of my data. I left language choices with participants, so we were speaking in Mandarin and English, but they did all have very high levels of English. So most of the discussion was in English, and what I'm presenting today, none of it is translated. So just a brief bit of background on why I'm working on these topics. I worked as a university teacher in mainland China and Hong Kong from 2008 to 2015. So there was a kind of background of me being a foreigner and hanging around with people who were gay like I am myself, and noticing the interesting cultural differences. And of course, as a sociolinguist, I was very much centered on the idea that language was important in the performance of identity, and also in culture and the way that culture manifests itself on a day-to-day level. I also chose this topic because I find that visibility of queer sexual identity is an especially accessible example of the role of language in identity performance. Because our queerness is most often indexed through what we say, this for me is a good example of why language is always fundamental to the identities that we show to each other. So one key concept that emerged during my ethnographic engagement was hanxu, reticence. And this is one quote from one of the people in my study who said that the Chinese people we like the ambiguity. We don't want to black and white, tear everything apart to see the reality. Sometimes we would like to leave us both sides a little bit room. So a little bit, we're probably not 100% sure what's going on. It's something that we presume, yeah. So my parents probably have considered this, so they've already known it's a possibility. Well, it's probably not like they know this for sure. There are other possibilities. So this was quite an important theme when I talked to participants in this project, but also during the whole of my time in China talking to queer identified individuals. This idea of culture coming in quite strongly, that there's a sort of Chinese way of doing things. And that was often discussed in terms of reticence, this idea that Chinese people tend to not want to say things directly. There's some kind of ambiguity there. And this often came up when people were discussing relations with their parents and whether or not they chose to tell anybody about the fact that they were interested, sexually interested in the same gender. So this is a concept which has been dealt with in the literature. We can define it as a communicative preference for verbal indirectness, humility, subtlety, and interpreter sensitivity. And Liu and Ding, who wrote a very influential paper, suggests that this is a dominant aesthetic ethical value, suggesting that it's a cultural phenomenon that applies to Sinophone contexts or Chinese contexts more broadly. But also they say it's a model behavior, that's really highlighting the widespread power and influence of this kind of way of doing things. And what I was particularly interested in with regard to reticence was how this was manifest in day-to-day language. This wasn't always in clear elements of vocabulary, but this is one example which is about that. So one of the participants talked about the labels that he used to describe his same-gender attraction. And instead of saying, I'm into men or I like boys, 我喜欢男生, he said, sometimes we say it more directly, like I think he has some problems or he has some secrets. In Chinese, we say 问题. So that's an interesting word in itself because it can mean problem or secret. So there's a play on words there. Sometimes I would just say 我是, I am, or 我不是, I am not, especially in the public. And you know, people often use 你是吗, like are you, to hide. If we make this conversation with gay people, we will know what we mean. So, of course, it's not only in mainland China and it's not only in Mandarin that this kind of language is used, but it's interesting to try and tie the kind of thing we've been talking about on the last few slides down to the specific language that people use on a day-to-day level. And this is a clear example of that. And when I was observing this kind of language and trying to trace reticence and other approaches to same-gender attracted identity, I was always challenged by the playoff between useful generalization and problematic essentialism. So I didn't want to go out and say that Chinese gays do things in this particular way, or even that Chinese people tend to do things in this particular way. But of course, we have to accept that there are some generalizable social trends that can be organized according to culture. So although I did perceive a salience of reticent styles when it came to indexing queer identity, both in mainland China and in Taiwan and in Hong Kong, I did find it quite problematic that the implications of cultural uniqueness that tended to be associated with that. You'd often hear people saying, this is a Chinese way, very much a specifically Chinese way of doing things. So I wanted to investigate how far we could generalize these things. And I noticed also a strong tendency in related academic literature to describe queer life in China in monolithic and sometimes dichotomous terms, making comparisons with Western ways of doing things. Now, here's an example from Li Yinhe, an extremely influential sociologist who is widely acknowledged as the founding mother of the mainland Chinese LGBT plus movement and a hugely influential and important figure, both in terms of the academic community and the broader mainland Chinese community, because she raised awareness of these issues in an important way. But one of the things she says is that Chinese people usually regard the more common behaviors according to morality, while they understand less frequent behaviors as abnormal and unethical. And what I was interested in was looking at broad generalizations like this, broad cultural generalizations, and trying to look for the gray areas and say, okay, what about, for example, urban, educated, cosmopolitan, young Chinese people in places like, for example, Shanghai and Chengdu. Can we say the same thing about them? And obviously, things start to get complicated when we open up these gray areas. But I'm interested in finding out how identity is performed and how it's shifting and how different aspects of our life stories and our personal upbringing and our families can affect things just as much as our culture can.